Nicholas Wade is one of the most influential science journalists in the world. After working at the journals Nature and Science, he was a science reporter and editor at the New York Times for 30 years. I used his articles for homework assignments many times in high school and college. He's written several books, including A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History in 2014. In 2021, he published an article titled The Origins of COVID, Did People or Nature Open Pandora's Box at Wuhan?, which played an instrumental role in making the lab leak theory of COVID mainstream. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for that kind introduction.
Now, most research on race differences focuses on the cause and consequences of variation in IQ. A Troublesome Inheritance focuses on evolved differences in social behavior among groups. So why did you decide to take this approach to human variation?
Well, I was really taking the approach that the variation in the human population was of great interest in terms of tracing human history. So I was ignoring the political dimensions of race, and as much as possible, I was just writing a scientific book based on the information that for the first time was streaming out of the genome that let you really say quite a lot of things about how our population is differentiated. I tried to, I guess, keep off or finesse the IQ issue because it's so controversial and it would sort of distract from the rest of what the book was saying. So I kind of punted on that and I just sort of laid out the best evidence I had available at the time.
Well, of course, now you actually don't take a very strong or clear position on the cause of IQ differences among populations in the book. I mean, of course, there are some statements where it's strongly implied that it's plausible that there are differences, that evolution could have played a role in producing the differences that we see among populations. It was interesting that among your critics, they highlighted the fact that Wade says that there are genetic differences in IQ, which was actually, they just assumed that that was what you were saying. Probably they didn't read the book. But your thesis, you can put it in your words, but in short, is that the transition to agriculture was precipitated by the evolution of new social instincts, and that the divergence among the continental populations occurred with respect to social instincts and then made certain populations more susceptible to the Industrial Revolution and certain kinds of what we would consider advanced societies, whereas others went in a different direction.
Well, that's right. On the intelligence front, I said, I agreed that there are sort of clear differences between the races in terms of IQ, and these are well validated. But I think you're on dangerous ground when you try and compare IQs between different races because of sort of differences in nutrition and health and so forth. So my message on IQ in that book was be very careful in comparing the IQs of different population. And the main thesis of the book, as you said, was the suggestion that since so many things vary between races, it's perfectly reasonable that social behavior could have varied in ways that account for some of the significant differences between today's populations. So I was particularly impressed by the data from Gregory Clark showing that you could see strong changes in behavior in the English population from 1100 to 1800, where the Industrial Revolution started, and that these changes, which were in terms of increased literacy, decreased violence, might well have been responsible for the Industrial Revolution, not just in Britain, but in fact for all countries that had been under agrarian economies for a long time. Because it's very hard. It's very hard to survive in an agrarian economy. You're under the conditions, the exact conditions that Malthus described. So this explains why the Industrial Revolution spread so easily from Britain to all the other countries in Europe and East Asia once it had got going. It just happened to start in Britain, but it was a feature of agrarian populations. So I see no reason to deny the possibility that there was some genetic change there. After all, everything else, all genes are subject to genetic change when the right pressure is applied. So why not social behavior?
Yeah, I think people like to talk about IQ because IQ also seems to offer an explanation for some of the facts that you address, and also there's a more straightforward way of measuring it. Of course, there are issues with comparing populations on IQ scores, but according to another view, aspects of the environment, including some aspects of the environment that you highlight, like agriculture and the Malthusian conditions associated with that, would have selected simply for general intelligence. And as documented, for example, by Garrett Jones, you might know his book, Hive Mind, where he talks about how higher intelligence in a population generally leads to greater cooperation, more patience, more foresight, which support more effective institutions on a societal level. So maybe there could be some of both going on, but how much importance would you place on potential differences in general intelligence?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, intelligence certainly sounds a good thing, and I'm sure it is. But I guess you can be very successful without intelligence. What I'm trying to say is intelligence is clearly not the only thing for economic success. After all, on paper, the East Asians are slightly more intelligent than the Europeans, and yet European societies have been just as successful. So it's not everything.
Also speaking about the differences between Asia and East Asia and Europe, just I think it was 1 year after your book was published that these studies came out on the effects of rice versus wheat farming, which found that a number of traits like collectivism and conformity that are stereotypically associated with East Asia may be associated with rice farming. In fact, those regions of China that engage in rice farming versus wheat farming show a pattern of differences that are consistent with wheat farming producing more individualism. And there was actually a controlled experiment, an accidental experiment, a natural experiment, I guess, where Mao randomly assigned groups of people to wheat versus rice farming. Just one group was below a river and one group was above the river. So above the river, that was more favorable for wheat farming, and below for irrigating rice paddies. And then later, a few generations later, the descendants of the rice farmers were exhibiting more collectivism and so on. So I wonder, do you think this might play a significant role in these differences?
Yes, it's certainly possible. It's just I guess one has to be so careful with these sort of broad studies. I mean, it's a very interesting hypothesis, but now you need to sort of follow up and try and find the genes responsible. And it's a pity that there's essentially a taboo on much of the research into genes that differ between human races, which is such a pity because nature has provided this natural experiment for us that allows us to see which genes do what. I mean, if we were all clones, we would have no clue as to where to start. But
so you have an interesting alternative explanation for how a selection for collectivism might have existed in the East Asian population, largely because of geography and elements. If I understood you correctly, first there was the geography of Europe was less conducive to a single empire reigning supreme over the continent, whereas in East Asia, where it was more manageable, it was more possible to have one administrative state overseeing everything. And then on top of that, China adopted the imperial examination system, focusing on memorizing classic texts and writing stylized commentaries on them, rather than breaking new ground, and that this could potentially have had an evolutionary effect on them. I'd seen some other discussions that suggested actually the imperial examination system might not have been eugenic at all, because large numbers of people. It was like graduate school is today. People would spend years and years studying for the imperial examination system and not have any kids, and then a very small, a minuscule number of those contenders would actually make it, and it would be good for them. But you mentioned in the book that, well, actually, in the early days, it was a much smaller population, so that might have made it more feasible to improve the gene pool, or at least their ability to pass this test.
I think so. Even though the numbers of people who entered the examination system was quite small, nonetheless, it went on for quite a long, for a sustained period, for many centuries, and I think it had a very strong effect on the people who rose to the top. They were able to have more children and more surviving children. So you could have had a significant demographic impact, and that might be responsible for part of the reason of high Asian IQ.
Yeah. Although then Korea adopted an imperial examination system later. They had it for the last two, for Goryeo and Joseon dynasties, almost 1,000 years, I think. And as far as I know, Japan didn't have such a system, though. So, I mean, it might have. I mean, I'm sure it had some effect on the gene pool, of course. People who passed the tests and had a lot of genetic success. but the fact that there are certain commonalities between China, Korea, and Japan might suggest that that wasn't the decisive factor.
Yes, that is a difficulty for the examination theory. So one might fall back on the fact that they're all agrarian economies, so we're under the same Malthusian pressure as the English population.
Yeah. Well, and their history of agrarianism would explain how they were receptive to the Industrial Revolution. But the history of rice farming specifically, if you consider what is involved in wheat farming versus rice farming, that really calls to mind the stereotypical differences between Europeans and East Asians. I don't know how much stock we should put in that kind of intuition, but it feels like it makes sense.
Yeah, sure. It's a robust, broad brush hypothesis that certainly deserves looking into.
Yeah, you mentioned how like comparing Europe and the Islamic world and China in the 17th century and today, there are certain patterns that seem to have persisted. The Islamic world is still somewhat inward-looking, and China is an autocracy and cut off to outsiders. And you mentioned how some of these impulses, especially in East Asia, could be rooted in these evolved population differences. But it's interesting how, although democracy takes a somewhat different form in where it occurs in East Asia, and people in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Korea, Japan, they're quite committed to democracy and very sensitive to any kind of threat to that. I mean, we just saw in Korea an attempt by the president, a very bungled attempt to reverse that, and the population reacted overwhelmingly against him. I spent 3 years in Hong Kong teaching at Lingnan University, and the students were, really concerned about what is the CCP. They're trying to introduce, they're trying to influence the textbooks. They're very keen on standing up to them. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily inconsistent with anything you said. There could still be a slight difference in average tendencies among the populations that explains why something like China was possible. At least it was possible. But there is, but still, it is. It suggests that the genetic tendencies of the population allow quite a bit of possibilities.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I'm always keen on finding genetic explanations because I think they're systemically underlooked or denied, but one has also at the same time to allow a large room for cultural explanation. So I think a lot of politics is culture. I think the genome probably sets out the sort of basic structure of a human society, but obviously it's a very flexible one since we've had so many different societies throughout history. I would look to a cultural explanation for the workings of democracy in those three countries.
So, like the standard explanation for population differences in outcome is, of course, it's white racism. So, I mean, has many obvious problems. Why do East Asians outperform whites in many ways? I mean, the U.S., which is supposed to be white supremacy, and whites are kind of in the middle of the pack in many outcomes when it comes to income, education, crime rates. Same in the UK. But anyway, I think that is not really something to take very seriously. But maybe some more interesting, alternative explanations to the genetic one. I mentioned IQ as potentially being the dominant factor. And on the environmentalist side, there's Jared Diamond, who has a kind of geographic deterministic theory. It's interesting. He's a very celebrated figure in this discussion. But you point out something that I also tried to bring to people's attention, is that actually Jared Diamond does believe in race differences. He says that the Australasian people and Stone Age people in general are they're more intelligent than whites, for example, or Asians, I guess, because they're subject to harsher selection pressures, and so therefore, so just logically, he says they should be more intelligent. And of course, he says they strike him as more intelligent. That's his impression. Now, his book won every award possible for a book, right? And he's a hero, and nobody is right. It's interesting how the standard of evidence is different depending on what you're arguing, right? You or I cannot say that, well, in our experience, Koreans tend to be more intelligent than people from the Congo. So yeah, and then come up with some story about how there's some selection pressures. If we did that, then 139 geneticists would sign a petition and say that we're discredited.
Yeah, well, we're living in an era when the whole academic world has been skewed sharply to the left, and everything else is affected by that. I'm sure the balance will be righted in time, but for the moment, Darwin, for example, can get away with very foolish observations like the one you describe and not be called out on it. I think his books, his early books were very good up until The Third Chimpanzee, which was about the third chimp. That was very good. But then his celebrated book, Guns, Germs and Steel, I think is very perverse, because if you read it carefully, it's the politics that's driving the science. So the whole book is sort of framed around genetics. It can't be responsible for anything. It must be environment, which is an absurd thesis, because the way evolution works is by an interaction between genetics and the environment. It's absurd to say it's all one or all the other. It's the interaction between the two, and that is a point his book was entirely blind to.
Yeah, well, but he falls on the right side of the issue. So, another book which I actually was very impressed by was Joseph Henrich's book on the weirdest people in the world. I don't know if you read it, but he has a lot of really impressive data about how the amount of exposure a population gets to the church's marriage and family program, basically breaking up the family lineages, kind of the tribal lineages in Europe, paved the way for individualism and the kind of city urbanization and ultimately the Industrial Revolution. And he really does have. I usually when it comes to like social psychology, like there's some really obvious alternative explanation, or it looks like it's probably just fraud or something. And like there were a few cases where he cites, priming studies where you should probably take it with a grain of salt. But a lot of his argument seemed to be really strong. But I think, and so the idea, so the church changes inheritance laws, changes marriage laws. So you're not allowed to marry your cousins. So you break up these family networks. People have to go and marry somebody from a different family. And this had a revolutionary effect on the psychology of people who were subject to this. I thought the big issue for me was I didn't understand how this explained East Asia's ability to receive these ideas and to take over with the Industrial Revolution, because it had not been subject to the church's marriage and family program. So even though I really am impressed by what Henrik has done and a lot of his argument, it seems to fail by not acknowledging a potential genetic component that prepares a population for this culture.
Right, there's not a mention of the word genes in his book, which seems somewhat of an oversight.
Yeah, if only he had, at least I wish he had just acknowledged IQ as a variable. And I think there's something to what he said. There has to be some process of breaking up, the tribal connections. And so I think you actually mentioned that in the book, that the church's ban on cousin marriage was a factor that helped this process along, if I remember correctly.
Right, because the tribes had various mechanisms for keeping wealth inside the tribe, because of the early mortality in those days. Often you had no direct heir, so you would resort to stratagems of the leverage of marrying your brother's widow or marrying cousins. So the church forbade all that and told people they should leave all their money to the poor, meaning to the church. And very quickly, the church became the largest landowner in most countries of Europe. And at the same time, the tribes were completely destroyed.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk a bit about the response to your book, which we already touched on a bit. So it's interesting. You published this with Penguin Press, very mainstream place.
Right.
Post, George Floyd. It's not obvious that it would be easy to place a book like this with a major press. Is there any story behind that? Like how you were able to publish that? Or,
I didn't think so. I mean, they'd published 2 previous books I'd written on recent human evolution. So this was just the third in a series.
But you, yeah, I think it's been a while since a book such as this was given mainstream platform.
Yes, because it's become impossible to write in the subject nowadays. Everyone's too afraid of each other to publish any sort of any scientific appraisal of how the human population has differentiated itself as it spread through the globe. I mean, it's an obvious subject of scientific interest, and yet because of the power of the ultra left in our universities, no one dares talk about it now.
Yeah, I don't know if you know anything about my background, but in December 2019, I published a paper in philosophical psychology. At the time, I was a DPhil student at Oxford, and I argued. It was called Research on Group Differences in Intelligence, a Defense of Free Inquiry. And that's basically all it was, like a defense of free inquiry. But as part of the defense of free inquiry, I reviewed some of the evidence for race differences. I mean, why should we take it seriously in the first place, right? Because there is some evidence that suggests there could be race differences in intelligence. And there was a petition to retract the paper and fire the editors, and then a group of professors wrote a response, which was, I mean, the usual stuff. I mean, there's more variation between within populations, between populations. All you know that. The whole deal, and the editor-in-chief asked them to make some revisions. Massimo Pigliucci, I think, was the leader of the pack, and then Pigliucci wrote a blog post saying that the editors rejected our commentary on the racist paper, and then the editorial board was intimidated because they felt they were being attacked on social media. So they decided to overrule the editors-in-chief and publish their commentary without any revisions. And then the editor-in-chief resigned in protest because of that. And then there was a second editor-in-chief who then apologized for publishing my paper in the first place. Although it wasn't retracted, but in the end, then that guy got fired anyway. And I guess they replaced everybody on the editorial board who, I don't know, somehow on the wrong side. And so that was what happened to philosophical psychology. Then there was another instance where, so I've written also on the theory that Jews are genetically or culturally adapted to undermine Gentile society for their own benefit, and that as part of this effort, they promote liberalism and multiculturalism and that sort of thing. So I was critical of that view, and my opponent is psychologist Kevin MacDonald. I don't know if you know his name. He has the theory of Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy. So I've written a series of articles about him. One of them was in the philosophy journal Philosophia. So it was called The Anti-Jewish Narrative, and I describe his theory and why I disagree with it. And then he published a response to me in Philosophia. And then people were mad because he's an anti-Semite, right? So one of the associate editors resigned in protest, and then the philosophy community was piling on him. Why did Philosophia accept this garbage? And of course, my article was also bad because I was platforming the anti-Semite by taking him seriously. And then the editor-in-chief of Philosophia subjected his paper. I thought they might try to retract mine too, but they subjected his paper to post-publication peer review, I believe they called it, meaning they sent it to some, activists who said that it's bad, it's right. Now, I think his paper was wrong, but why should you? If there's a debate, you can't only publish one side of the debate, right? So,
Sure.
so I thought they should both be published, and people can see which one they compare the arguments and see what they agree with. So yeah, and then the editor-in-chief of Philosophia then was gone soon after that. I think he said that he retired willingly. Some people thought that he had been fired, so I don't know exactly what happened with that. Then earlier this year, I just started publishing on Substack. If I have something, in some philosophical idea or some idea in political theory connected with race. Like, okay, so I publish it in a journal, they're just going to fire the editor and then retract it. So it's like, but then that raises the question of, what's the point of having philosophy journals if you're not allowed to be controversial?
Well, the whole behavior of the academic community is so bizarre to people who look at it from the outside. I mean, it's a bunch of children with the adults have fled the campus, and the children sort of live by denouncing each other. The mere question that free speech is not allowed on a university campus is so appalling that I cannot think this current regime will last for very long. But anyway, that is realistically the situation we are in now, that some subjects are so controversial that you only have to be denounced, and this sort of cycle of fear reverberates. I think one of the problems is that, as I understand it, for success in the academic world, you need almost unanimous approval from your peers, especially in getting scientific grants from the government. You only need one person on that peer review committee to blackball you, and you don't get your grant, and your career may be in jeopardy. So therefore, you can't afford to offend anyone. So that's what makes it possible for this very small minority of ultra-leftists who live by denouncing others to cow the whole campus. And that's why we get extraordinary brouhahas like the one you've described taking place.
Yeah, this is a disaster, as you say. If one person on the hiring committee, or just one person involved in the hiring process, doesn't like you, that will kill your candidacy. And the same for grants and everything else. I've never been on a hiring committee personally, but I know many people have. And in many cases, they end up hiring somebody who no one even likes, because it's just the one person that no one is really against. Now, for any area of science, I mean, especially philosophy, I care especially about philosophy, but in order to break new ground, you might have a kind of personality that doesn't appeal to every last person, or you might do things that some people disagree with. And if the standard for if you're not allowed to be in the profession unless you can be just as inoffensive to everybody, what kind of people are we selecting to be our scholars?
Right. I think the academic world is in deep trouble right now, and I don't know how long universities will be able to continue the way they have been doing, but they are abusing the public trust in so many ways that I think that if they can't regulate themselves, they will find themselves regulated by others.
Yeah, I don't know. I know a lot of people have been waiting a long time for the bubble to burst when it comes to universities. I mean, now uh, the correlation between having fancy degrees and actually being an impressive person is becoming, weaker and weaker. And I feel like if somebody said, "Ooh, I I went to Harvard," like 15 years ago, I think, okay, maybe you may or may not be a genius, but you're probably pretty smart. You probably scored high in the test. Uh, you were diligent and did something to distinguish yourself in some way, right? That's what I assume. Now, if somebody went to Harvard, what does it mean? Like, uh, is it really? Is it? Should I be much more impressed by that than somebody who went to, the University of Michigan or?
No, I think Harvard has shredded its reputation. After all, it chose as the person to lead it Claudine Gay, who has published almost nothing, and what she has published is full of plagiarism. So if that's how Harvard wants to present itself to the world, fine. But I don't think one can give any degree of respect to people who that kind of system produces.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's still these institutions, like the elite institutions, are still desirable places to be in some ways. Like, I mean, if Harvard is listening, I'm not saying I wouldn't take a job with you, but uh, but are they really centers of scholarship, leading scholarship in the way that they were? And it is disappointing, though, that there haven't been any alternative institutions to arise to take their place. Although it seems like there are a lot of opportunities for that. But conservatives, when they try to start their own institutions, they end up being just like great books programs or religious seminaries or libertarian centers where they just talk about, promote libertarian orthodoxy. So my hope is that there'll be some way to reform the existing institutions, but that will require major cultural change. And in my view, the acceptance of race differences, which is really the taboo underlying everything else.
Well, it's hard to foresee how it will change, but the system must change in some way. I think you see one significant change in the fact that fewer students are applying to Harvard. I think their application rates are considerably down from where they used to be. So bright students will just go elsewhere, and other institutions will have the chance to build their reputation, and people will just will be less mesmerized by Harvard and Princeton and Yale and maybe Cambridge and Oxford too, and we will find new centers arising. I assume that's how it will play out.
Yeah, it's. I hope so. I'm not happy about ceding all these institutions to activists. We're talking about tens and tens of billions of dollars. It's hard to start something from scratch, and then when you start something from scratch, and there's a risk that it just gets you put all this money in some new project, and then it gets captured. Then what do when they founded the first universities and Paris and Bologna, it's like when either the teachers or the students were dissatisfied with what was happening, they would just leave, and then they would say, "Okay, if you want to study with us in this new place, you can come and do that," or the students would say, "Okay, we're looking for teachers to come teach us." I don't know if some model like that could be feasible today, but people are still making impressive progress in certain areas of science and scholarship, and even in philosophy, although more in the technical areas of philosophy, nothing really connected with politics. Then philosophy has been largely corrupted in those areas. I don't know if it would be possible to support like a real community of scholars on the model of the 500 years ago.
Well, fashions change, and I think the Trump administration is likely to put strong pressures on universities to restore free speech. I think I've read that the newly appointed head of NIH, Dr. Bhattacharya, has said that he will condition grants to universities on the dismantling of their DEI apparatuses and on better scores for free speech. And Harvard, for example, comes dead last of 400 universities on the fire ratings for free speech. I mean, why should public money be given to a place that so abuses the basic principles of a university? I think the Trump administration will try and change that, maybe in a destructive way. I hope not, and maybe it won't succeed very far, but it could still sort of change the discussion in such a way that leads universities to reform themselves.
Yeah. Well, the head of the NIH, he's a genuine scholar and academic, so he knows what's actually going on at these universities. Most of the free speech advocates and so the anti-university conservatives are not really intellectuals, though, and they're kind of attacking scholarship from the outside, often in a kind of a way that makes them seem, and maybe they are, kind of anti-scholarship. And their view of education is thus to be, we got to get down to the basics and study Aquinas and and the Bible or the Virgil, the great books. Like that is their view of education, and those things are part of education. I'm not against that, but I mean, you can't have a university that only does that, or you have something like the University of Austin. I don't know if you know about this experimental university. It was founded by Barry Weiss and some people like that, where basically they hired a bunch of Twitter celebrities to be the faculty. The faculty that they hired, I mean, some of them are good, but they are who you would hire if all you knew about academics was what you got from being on Twitter. Like, I can't remember. I calculated that the median number of Twitter followers for their founding faculty was 50,000 or something like. And there are great scholars with a lot of Twitter followers, but that's not. They're looking at the wrong signal, right? Because they're not. That's the problem with a lot of these. The free speech crowd is they're not really scholars who understand how to reform the system.
Well, the reform of the universities is likely to be an ugly process, but the universities have brought it on themselves. If you fail to regulate your affairs properly, you will get regulated by people like the crowd of critics you describe.
Yeah.
it's their choice and a bad one they made.
So, regarding the origins of race denial, which I see as the root of wokeism, the root of the source of moral energy for the left, this project, well, if everybody's equal, we have to bring about equal outcomes. There's a moral emergency to do that. I mean, if you really believe that all people are equal, then I don't see how you can accept massive disparities between populations, which must be due to the environment. So you have to figure out how to fix the environment until you get equality. So in my view, the key is figuring out how to challenge that taboo. To do that, of course, it's useful to understand where the taboo came from, how it came about in the first place. You attribute it to Franz Boas. Now, this is something that I've written a fair amount about because of my debate with Kevin MacDonald, because I was interested in the question of whether Jews are responsible for this. MacDonald highlights Franz Boas as the man behind. Boas was, of course, Jewish. The man who came up with the orthodoxy and then kind of imposed it on the American anthropological community, social science community. I trace it back, the impulse for race denial back much further. I mean, even in 1690, John Locke said not only is the mind a blank slate, void of all, white paper, void of all characteristics, he specifically said that the difference between populations are just due to cultural conditioning, and that if you or I had been born in South Africa, we would be just like them. And if some Native American king had been born in England, he would be a mathematician, just like an Englishman, if he had the right education. So this impulse for both blank slateism and race denial has, from the very beginning, and John Locke was the father of liberalism and the father of blank slateism, and we can also add the father of race denial. So there's this for people who have these liberal political moral intuitions, the idea of blank slateism and race denial is very attractive. And then there were many leading leftist figures and socialists have also expressed this view. Alfred Russel Wallace, John Stuart Mill, then Theodore Waits was the authority who was accorded the most respect by Boas himself. Theodore Waits, a German scholar who wrote a book on the equality of the human races in 1859. That's just a year after Boas was born, where he basically presented the Boasian theory, what became known as Boasian theory. You mentioned Madison Grant as an opponent of Boas, who tried to get him fired from his job, from his chair of the department at Columbia. In Grant's book, if I remember correctly, I think he didn't mention his book about race and what he saw as popular myths about race. He didn't mention Boas by name a single time. He did allude to Boas, to the study of the cephalic index study of immigrants, as something that he disagreed with. But Grant himself, who knew all about Boas and his influence, attributed race denial to impulses going back to the French Revolution, So I think Boaz was obviously he was a major figure and influential and all that. But in order to to identify the source of the taboo and to make a plan to counteract it, I think one has to look at this deeper impulse that associates liberal intuitions with race denial.
Well, I think the whole idea of equality, in a way, it transcends race because you have inequality in a single population, and I think it's the idea of a meritocratic society is, or the consequences of it, are what upset people. Although on the one hand they admit that merit should be a decisive factor in hiring. On the other hand, they don't like the results. It becomes exacerbated when you describe the problem on a racial basis. But I don't think race is necessary. I think it's necessary to consider race for an analysis of the inequality problem.
Well, there are certainly many liberals who would acknowledge that there are differences among individuals, but then they would say, so that would be different from Locke's view, of course. Right? So Locke took a view which I think nowadays most people would reject, even on the left, extreme blank slatism. I mean, most liberals are, outside of the gender studies department, right, are willing to acknowledge that the children of LeBron James is going to be taller than average, and Einstein's child might be smarter than average. But they would say that, well, all these things are distributed equally among groups because there hasn't been enough time for differences to arise, and or whatever it is that they would say. Or they'd say, well, maybe there are differences, but we have no clue what they are. Right? That's another argument. But I think people have kind of had to face reality when it comes to the heritability of traits, at least within populations. It's just too obvious that the blank slate view is incorrect. But people have been able to cling to at least one element of the blank slate fantasy, which is that the differences between groups are all environmental. But as far as making race realism mainstream, so this is something that I've been pushing very, very strongly for. I think that any pushback against wokeism or leftist hegemony is going to be futile unless it addresses the source of the ideology. And a lot of people disagree with me. They say there's no hope. No one's ever going to accept this. There's no point. Okay, you have all your data and arguments or whatever. People don't care about that. They're just going to follow their feelings. Now, I am more optimistic. The reason for pessimism is that if you look at surveys of what people believe, especially the younger they are, the more extreme they are about being against free speech, in favor of cancel culture, and so on. So that's bad. But knowledge of race differences, it's pervasive among young intellectuals on the right. It's not even something people are arguing about among the Zoomers, to a lesser extent the millennials, but certainly among the Zoomers. They grew up with the internet. they know all about it's impossible not to know about the evidence for race differences, and they understand the political implications. And as they rise in the institutions, I think a lot of mainstream right-wing institutions will start to take on this issue. Right now, I can't publish in National Review or the American Conservative or be associated with the Claremont Institute. But what's going to happen in a few years? I think that that the conditions might change.
Oh, well, I hope so. It seems to me the important thing is to go back to a time when we made appointments on the basis of merit and of treating everyone equally and without discrimination. So with those principles, it doesn't matter what race a person is. You're just looking to construct a fair society in which people are rewarded for their merit.
Well, one major barrier for people accepting facts about race or taking this seriously is they think, well, if we acknowledge that or if we discovered that there were race differences, then that would mean one race is superior. There's a hierarchy of races, and all sorts of bad implications would follow from that. Now you resist this argument because there's no hierarchy. You can't say anybody is better than anyone else based on IQ or some other trait. Now here I might have a bit of a different view. Now, what does it mean for somebody to be superior or to have more worth than somebody else? Now, of course, there's no point of view of the universe or no independently existing standard with respect to which people are superior or inferior. But I mean, if you operationalize the concept of superiority, something that we would, if we're selecting an embryo, and one has trait A and one has trait B, in many cases we might prefer trait A. We might pay a cost to preserve trait A in ourselves or others. We might seek to cultivate trait A, but not B. Then, A might produce results that are good for other reasons. If the brain surgeon with an IQ of 140 saves people's lives, and somebody with an IQ of 80, who may be in other respects equally, meritorious, doesn't have the capacity to do as much good, even if he has just as good intentions. So I think there might be something to this, to the idea that race differences, not just race differences, but differences between individuals could have implications for the worth of the individuals. Now, of course, you can put an ominous spin on that and say, well, if somebody has more worth, they should rule, everybody else should be killed. Of course, that's not what I'm saying. But in certain circumstances, if you can only save two people, you can save one of two people. What is the relative intelligence? Something that would be part of your calculation, and I think that it might be.
Well, intellectuals have caused an awful lot of grief in the world with crazy schemes and ideologies. So I don't think one should necessarily put them at the top of the heap. In any case, although we're very well aware of ourselves as individuals, we don't survive as individuals. We survive in social groups. We survive as societies. So I think an easier question to pose is what societies are more successful than others. So if you look at the World Happiness Index, you'll find the happiest countries are generally sort of small, fairly homogeneous societies like Finland and Denmark. And the unhappiest ones are ones where you have a multitude of warring ethnicities like Lebanon or Afghanistan. So I guess the question is, well, to what extent does the nature of the individual, is the nature of the individual responsible for the overall happiness of the societies? And I suspect lots of other things sort of come into play, like historical development, geographical accident. I guess this is I'm veering towards an environmental argument of saying all humans are sort of more or less the same, but it's the differences of environment and culture that make societies different. I didn't really mean that, but I think that's part of the issue. And the thing that interests us is, well, to what extent does genetics contribute to this differentiation? And I think it's probably too early to say. We really don't know. These are some very complicated issues, and they've been very understudied. So it's very hard to draw a link between genetics and the sort of political success of a society.
But to the critic who says, well, if we found, we can't investigate this stuff because if we found that there are differences, that would be horrible, and it would have this moral implication that some people are in some sense superior to others. Now that's what I think. I don't think that's a good reason not to investigate these matters, but I do think that they're onto something in that, yeah, having, I mean, at least when it comes to intelligence, like one of the things that makes a normal person more valuable, we would say, than, say, a chimpanzee, is because the person has a superior ability to cogitate and plan and have an identity and have certain relationships which are all dependent on cognitive ability. And then the society as a whole tends to have, well, happiness, I guess, is complicated outcome to measure. But generally, more intelligent societies have better outcomes in most respects. So, I mean, I had some exchange about this with Noah Carl and Charles Murray, who are arguing that intelligence is not meaningfully related to human worth, and my approach is to just confront it head on and say yes, but I mean that doesn't mean that people with less of the good ability or the good trait should be discriminated against or killed or anything like that. It's just, in principle, and it's probably something that very, very rarely has practical implications. Like, it would very rarely have any relevance for our actual behavior or how we treat people. But just as a philosophical point, I think it's probably reasonable to think that would be the case.
I certainly think we should look into the differences, because they are enormously informative for telling us how the brain works. If we know, it would be lovely to understand why Jews, for example, as a small population, do so well on IQ tests. So if Jewish genetics allowed us to understand why the brain works better, that would be an enormous advance in knowledge. So we certainly shouldn't fear to explore the differences, though of course we should try and do so in a non-invidious way. The question of individual net worth is very difficult. I mean, that's not really a scientific question, I don't think.
Well, I'm a philosopher, so I can ask.
Okay, so it's a philosophical question. That's why we have philosophy, for the problems that are too difficult for science. And I think, as I said before, I think we should. It's better to shift the notion of worth from an individual to a group basis, because that's how evolution has raised us in terms of groups. We survive as groups. So some groups are better than others at doing certain things, and that's where maybe a notion of worth is applicable.
Although I think that's a reasonable position, although I don't think that would be less controversial than the idea.
No, maybe not. It's all controversial. Whenever you start making these comparisons.
Yeah. I mean, if we were allowed to discuss these issues openly, but what would academia look like? I mean, history, sociology, psychology, everything would be radically transformed.
They'd be enormously energized by taking genes into account, because genes are very important in all those subjects, and the fact that they don't leaves them arid and unable to advance, I think.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of psychologists, or the standard view in academia is that conservatives are underrepresented at universities because, their personality is not suited to scholarship. Now, there may be some element of truth to this. I'm somebody with like a genuine, like real conservative personality who that might not be the kind of person who, is focused on new ideas. I don't. But the political, in terms of politics, universities were much more balanced until very recently. Many
Yes.
of the greatest scholars in history and even the greatest artists have been right-minded people. If you were allowed to investigate differences, race differences between people, and the relevance of race for explaining history, I think a lot more people on the right would suddenly become interested in academia.
That may be true. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about that. I think it certainly be very healthy for this taboo on race differences to be dropped, and people could study it ad nauseam. I think we might well find it's not that important. Race differences really are trivial in comparison to the things that make us all the same. After all, we all have the same genome. It's just that different races have different patterns of differences. How important these are remains to be seen, but probably they're going to be of very, very much smaller importance than many people think. So I think it'd be salutary to, as I say, to drop the taboo and let it all hang out and move on to other things.
Well, last thing I want to talk about is your very influential article on COVID. Now, this isn't my my area of expertise, although I found it very interesting. As an example of groupthink and censorship in science and all that. Of course, it was intrinsically interesting just to know where this came from, the disease came from. The first thing that I noticed about the article is where it was published. I mean, I think certainly the most influential article published in the English language in 2021. And it was published on Medium and then in the Bulletin of the Atomic Sciences. which I'm sure is a very nice place to publish, but you know, uh, it's not where I would have predicted that something like that would come out. So, and I know there was of course a backlash to the article, although it really got people talking. That was what, you know, broke the dam, right? It got people talking about the lab leak thesis. Why did you publish it on Medium?
Oh, well, it's because I had no other choice. I offered the story to every outlet I could think of, left, right, and center. Well, mostly in the mainstream media, and it was just universally rejected. So finally, I thought, well, I'm just going to write this out of my system and self-publish it, which essentially is what Medium is. So that's what I did, and then within a few days, it was reprinted verbatim by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I think sort of gave it a little more, helped give it more visibility, and I think it had 1 million page views in both formats. And as you say, I think it was helpful in at least refocusing people's attention on the issue, and taking seriously the lab origins side of the question.
Yeah. You have some of the same problems in popular media that you have in academic journals. It's very strange that there's this conservatism, irrational fear, an inability to identify work which is obviously, going to be of interest to people.
Yes, the media's problem, I think, is that they've been sort of taken over by some kind of groupthink, and they're also sort of strongly allied to, I guess, the left. That's been a process that's been going on for several years, and newspapers that used to be centrist have now become far left. I think it's because you get a lot of power if you confirm people's opinions. If you confirm what the reader wants to believe, then you sort of build a stronger bond with that category of readers, and you're sort of safer there than if you try and report the news straight. So it's for that reason, or something like it, that the lab origin hypothesis of the COVID became anathema to the left. There's no scientific reason why it should be. It's just a purely scientific issue, and why should one care whether from the left or the right, whether it's true or not? One just wants the evidence, you would think. But no, the mainstream media have, to this day, have refused to publish the main evidence in favor of lab leak. They have totally betrayed their readers in failing to give them the relevant information.
Well, they're so concerned about the readers they have. They don't think of what we would get new readers if we would publish something like this. I had in my my paper on research on group differences in intelligence, that was published at Philosophical Psychology. It was desk rejected from another similar journal, and their reason was that, well, it doesn't appeal to their readership, which was, well, actually, it was a smart decision. I mean, they just would have been fired if they published it, so,
Right.
which might have been the real reason. But like that article is, then now by far the most read article in Philosophical Psychology. And so they would have gotten a lot more readers. There were, but there's this, it's not just, it's in kind of in the zeitgeist, right? So it's not just an academic thing that people don't really want to push the
Yeah, it reflects this culture of fear. The editors fear to go out on a limb to publish things they think may be unpopular. it's it's a McCarthyite era that we're living in, and soon may it end.
Yeah. Well, my podcast, the Coffinist podcast, was kicked off of YouTube because they didn't like my my interview with Noah Carl.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, but I think I can. They gave me a strike on my account. I could get rid of the strike if I would take their class in how not to commit hate speech, but I refuse to do that. So if I get another strike, then I think they'll. I don't know if they delete my channel or they just. But anyway, I can still upload the video to YouTube, and of course it will be on my Substack, which is a free speech zone. So that's the main place that people can find me. So I saw you have a new book coming out. Is that right? The Origin of Politics.
Oh, right. Yeah, next year sometime.
Ah, that looks interesting.
Well, I hope it will be.
So people should look out for that. And if you haven't read Troublesome Inheritance, definitely you should. And anything else you want to add?
No, I don't think so. That seems to cover the field.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.